Welcome to the proposed Floodplain Management Overlay District meeting. There are a few things that I needed to cover with you before we get into it. First of all, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Heather Seifert. I'm a colleague of Jerry's in the System Planning Department. I focus on specialty planning projects as well as community engagement, so I'm going to be helping out with this meeting. This is a webinar format, so you can communicate through the question and answer feature. And so we will be monitoring the questions that are submitted and then breaking periodically to answer those questions verbally. With some questions we might be able to answer through written, but most of it we're going to try to cover verbally so everybody can hear the question and hear the answer. You can leave and rejoin the meeting anytime if you'd like to, unless you are kicked out for being inappropriate, but let's not let it come to that. There'll be multiple opportunities for questions throughout the presentation. So what we're going to try to do is let people, both Jerry and Anthony are going to be speaking tonight, and so let people get through portions of the presentation, and then when there's some natural breaks, we'll stop for a moment and I'll read off the questions that have been submitted up to that point. This is going to be posted on the web page that's listed up there, so you'll be able to go back and look at it. This is being recorded. And there's also additional information on that web page, so you can go back and see this recording as well as read more about just the background of the proposed floodplain overlay district. So just some technology overview. I'm sure at this point many people are getting pretty used to Zoom, so possibly I don't even need to go over this, but just in case, again, we are using the question and answer feature this time because it is a webinar format. So you can see that at the bottom of your screen there, there's an icon that's question and answer, and so you can submit your questions through that. If you are on the phone, and we have a graphic on here, which I'm realizing is really silly because you can't see it if you are on the phone, but if you are on the phone and would like to ask a question, press *9, and that will virtually raise your hand. And so we will, when the time is appropriate, we will open it up so that you can speak. Okay. Ground rules. I like to have ground rules at every meeting that I facilitate. This is something that I share with everybody. I'm not expecting this group to be particularly rowdy, but I do like to have these standard ground rules, which are commit to learning, and avoid speculation. We encourage you to ask questions so we can explore this issue together. And please remember the importance and rights of the dignity of others. We ask that you critique ideas, not people, and are thoughtful about your language so this can be comfortable and respectable to all participants. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brett, who's going to fill you in a little bit more about the lineup tonight and introduce Tony and Jerry.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, very much for quarterbacking this for us this evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We've got a pretty good group, looks like about 23 attendees. So while not quite as much as our first webinar, we are thrilled that you are joining us this evening. As indicated, we're going to try and stop a couple times for questions, but Heather's going to help make sure that to keep us honest too if there's appropriate questions during the flow of the presentation. We're going to be covering two particular aspects of the presentation this evening. The first is going to be Tony Bedone. Tony is a senior application specialist with the city. I like to think of him as our GIS guru, our geographic information system. So he's going to give an overview of some improvements that he has led to improve the interface of our online mapping system so that any member of the public can understand how the floodplain might be proximate or on their property. So we're going to have a brief introduction to that new map, show how it works. And then we're going to turn it over to Jerry Hancock. Jerry Hancock is our stormwater and floodplain coordinator and has been doing the yeoman's work on this important proposed ordinance update. Just to set the stage, I'm sure Jerry will get into some of this as well. There are already a lot of existing floodplain regulations in place, both on a sort of currently a minimal level in our UDC, our Unified Development Code, but there's a lot of extensive regulations already in our building codes, which are stipulated by the state of Michigan in our adoption of them. And so a lot of the provisions that are being proposed to be added to our Unified Development Code are actually sort of reflecting those existing building code standards or sort of appending those standards, all with the goal of not only improving and protecting property and people, but also providing some benefits to property owners in the city over the long term. So we look forward to your questions. At the end of those two presentations, we should have plenty of time for questions that we don't get to during the course of the presentation. We will share the report of those questions as well as the video that Heather mentioned that we will be posting at the conclusion of the webinar tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. And as I'm talking, Tony, I probably need to make sure that you have the right authorities to be able to share your screen.
Looks like that's available now. So. Okay, thank you very much, Brett. Welcome everybody to the map portion of the webinar. Everybody can see the screen, I assume, yes?
Yep.
Okay, yep. So this is our A2Gov homepage. There's a few easy ways to get to the flood map. The easiest way I like to show is when you're on A2Gov, there is this property information link on the right here, and you can link to that. And these are some of our property information resources. One of the highlighted links is this floodplain map right here. And you'll see there's also a URL I'm hovering down here at the bottom that shows a2gov.org/Ann Arbor flood. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and the viewer will load. And that's what I had in this tab here. So this is the first look of the viewer. We strive to simplify this viewer to provide information to our public and business customers and make it as easy as possible for anybody interested to understand floodplain resources and how it could impact them or their property. So we're going to use a couple target sites, and we're going to start with Jerry's house, and I'm going to type in his address here. And if you start beginning to type any address within the city limits, it will geolocate you. So here's that property, and the map will zoom in with this simple balloon that just indicates the search result. So I'm going to start by showing, you can kind of see over here some colors for floodplain. We will go ahead and open up this legend here. Here's our layer list. And we're going to get into the details of all the layers in just a moment. But what I wanted to show first is there's an opportunity to view a handful of base maps that we maintain here at the City GIS program. We start with our most basic base map, which is really an address, street, and building footprint overlay. And one of the options on here is our plat overlay, which indicates some of the plat details, the legal recorded blocks, the dimensions, and historic lot configurations. We have some other pieces of information in here like the 1-foot contours. These are contours that were obtained relatively recently in late 2018, and these were shared across the SEMCOG region. So all 7 counties in the SEMCOG region share this latest contour overlay. So this is something we're all relying on currently.
SEMCOG is the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, for those that were wondering.
Yep, it's our regional organization that all of us are part of, the 7-county Southeastern Michigan region. Thanks, Brett. And then we have on here an overlay that fuses together aerial imagery and contours. Here it comes. So another look at this where you can see the imagery in context to topographic lines. And then finally, we have our simple imagery, which is just the imagery itself. And we have a few years, 2018, 2015, and 2012 available currently on the page. So as you're browsing the floodplain information, you can switch the base map gallery to visualize any of the different underlays to your map as needed. So that was a property where the floodplain wasn't. So let's search over to a property that does have floodplain. We're going to look at West Kingsley. So again, here's another site where we know has floodplain. And you can use this layer list to turn on and off layers that might be of interest to you. So here's the floodway. And here is one of the pieces of information we're going to be focusing on tonight, which is the 1% annual chance of flood plus 50 feet. So we're calling this the zoning overlay district. You're going to hear much more about this evening, but that's what that geography looks like. And then here is the 1% flood, and this is the 0.2% flood. And so that's basically the general information on here. The other piece of value, two other parts of value on this site are point locations of where elevation certificates have been recorded and letters of map change. So the elevation certificates are the green stars and the letters of map change are the pink stars. And if you simply just click on any of the stars, you're going to see a small balloon that's going to summarize some of the detail associated with this specific elevation certificate. And if you want to see, view, or download said certificate, you can go ahead and click on the hyperlink and a new tab will open with that available to you.
And for those who don't know, elevation certificate is required if a building is improved or built new. This specific one we're looking at was used as part of a FEMA application to remove the building. This site is where the fish sculptures are at, or people call it fish park.
We call it fish park. I forgot to mention in my underlay description that we are very soon going to be getting our 2020 imagery, and we will put that up on the website right away. So you can kind of see the top of those fish. There they are. This was a rain garden installation, right, Jerry, that was done here.
Yep.
And there's some art as well. So
yeah, what you're seeing there is that this site is in the floodway portion of the floodplain.
Yeah, right inside the floodway itself. So let's switch back to our plat base. There it goes. So as that's loading, we also have letters of map change, which are the pink stars, which you'll get a slightly different balloon, but there's some information. If you know about letters of map change, this A suffix indicates an amendment. And again, you can view or download that letter of map change.
So and letters of map change are where someone has submitted better survey information than FEMA has to FEMA to prove that the building is out of the floodplain. That's what an amendment would be. And then a letter of map revision would be at a site where grade changes were made, and then this property owner went through the process of providing that to FEMA to show that there was a change. And on this, what you're seeing right here, there's one that where they made a change and the building is out of the floodplain.
So how this is managed in the GIS world is these floodplain boundaries themselves are relatively static and were delivered to us back in 2012 when FEMA went through the map modernization process. And these stars indicate areas where essentially amendments, revisions, elevation certificates have happened to improve the map. And we're making case of keeping track of those at individual site and GIS locations and then providing the documentation to you all. And then the very last thing I'll highlight on the map before we go into questions is there's also the cross-sectional profiles available on the map. So as you get to an appropriate scale, you'll begin to see cross-sections for each stretch of floodplain. And something that's now available is if you click it directly on the cross-section, you're going to get a little bit more detail again in the balloon about the cross-section itself. So this is the Allen Creek, and this indicates profile E. So the cross-section for profile E, and you can open that actual profile right here. And this should be the page or very close to the page of Allen Creek's documentation. And then you can see right here, here is, you know, E to E primed, and that is where that flood elevation profile is recognizing. So this is now available to you through this, and we can go through some business cases.
And those profiles are used to determine flood elevation. The flood maps are not used for flood elevation. It's only the profiles. I mean, there are some other methods, but the main way to figure out elevation is through those.
And so that is the information we have available to you. We tried to make this as detailed as we needed to, but also as slick and clean as it could be, so it could be effective and run efficiently on a mobile device. I mean, we do have property information in here too. The city parcels are not turned on by default, but you can turn them on. And if you get to an appropriate scale, you can learn more about a given site. This all comes from the city's assessor's tax database. And there's lots of additional information in here, like the acreage and front footage and sale dates and whatnot. So that is also public information that we're making available to our team through this map portal. So that is the interactive part of the map I wanted to show, but I'd love to take some questions and comments about the map now, and we also can cycle back to that later if there's more questions.
Yeah, let's start with any questions about this mapping feature. There are a number of questions that came in, obviously,
Okay.
regarding some questions that were sent earlier about the proposed ordinance in general, but let's just pause now just to answer any questions that are directly related to the mapping feature that Tommy shared. So if anybody has any questions, I will look for those, and then we'll get back to everything else that's been submitted so far.
Well, Heather's looking for that. I would mention that the product that you're seeing is a brand new product. It's different than what you saw up to maybe about 2 weeks ago. We switched formats, and as a user of this, I would say this is a much easier format to use than the previous format that was available.
Well, thanks, Jerry. We're working as a GIS program to modernize all our maps, make them easier for everyone in the world to consume. And really the thought is the new technology works much, much better on a smartphone or a tablet device. So really that was part of my priority. If you have feedback that you don't want to comment on tonight about the map, go ahead and click on this map feedback link in the About balloon. And then lastly, I will say you can go directly to our detailed floodplain page on the city's website by clicking that link. And this is kind of internally where we publish floodplain management information through A2Gov. And, you know, somewhere on here, there's a link to get you back to the map, in fact. So, a big cycle. So any comments, questions, or feedback about the map?
Yep, there is a question that came in, or a suggestion that says, perhaps you could give an example of a floodplain for a surface stream rather than Allen Creek, which is underground most of the time.
Absolutely. So, I mean, one of the branches of the upper Mallets we can come take a look at here. Mm-hmm. If that suits that need. And again, as you come in, we start with the very basic map underlay. And of course, again, you can still switch to the plats like we saw a moment ago. And then by default, the cross sections are turned off, remember, because you know, there's a fair amount of detail involved with them, but you can turn them on in your layer list. And again, open that same profile. See, this profile happens to have more information was provided to us from FEMA. So there's things like the velocity and the top width and the bed elevation. But again, that same profile document or similar equivalent profile document is right here for you. Hopefully that gets at the question somebody was asking.
Are there any other questions or any follow-up that the part that David has on that? Okay, well, thank you, Tony.
Hey, you're very welcome. I'm happy to share this technology with everyone.
Great. All right, well, getting back to the questions that have been submitted so far. I think most of these, if not all of these, are from an earlier document that was submitted, and I assume that most people that are on the line are probably members of the Westside Homeowners Group that have some concerns about this ordinance. So let's get into that. So there was a set of questions that was submitted earlier, and Jerry and Brett and possibly other staff members put together some answers for that. All of that will be posted on the website, so that will be going up. So everybody is able to see that. There are also questions, the same questions being submitted through the question and answers. So I'm just going to check in with Jerry and Brett now on how we would like to answer these in this meeting. Jerry, do you feel that most of these questions will be covered during your presentation? Or would either of you want to address some of them right now?
Well, I guess I would start. There was a question about sort of the forthright nature of our responses to them. I guess I will let our responses speak to that. I think that that's a matter of opinion. I think that we did attempt to answer these in a forthright way. So my inclination is to go ahead and have you do kind of a quick run through of the presentation that you were planning on, Jerry, and then maybe we can just get to these questions as quickly as we can after that, and then that provides the opportunity if any other questions arise out of that, and you know, then we can. I guess we would maybe perhaps just try and hit several of these questions and just try to be as clear as we can about our responses and why it is what it is.
All right, sounds good.
And all of these questions will be on record and shared with the Planning Commission, so everybody knows that.
And posted online.
And posted online, yep.
That's not what you need. Here we go.
Oh, I did have another question that came in, I think related to Tony's. Are these firms correct? Cross sections are real, map boundaries speculative?
They are from FEMA, but I'll let Jerry answer that.
Can you repeat that?
Are these firms correct? Cross sections are real, map boundaries speculative?
So what the cross section means is that FEMA or FEMA's contractor actually did a survey at that point, and so the flood boundary and elevation are very accurate at those locations. In between, they are interpolated.
And as far as the boundaries go, they are the boundaries that have been shared publicly from FEMA to all of our communities and are on the flood insurance rate map. So it's the same GIS features that are presented on the flood insurance rate maps we're showing you here. We have not made any adjustments in any way, shape, or form, other than the buffer, which again, we'll talk about at some point tonight.
Right. We're able to change the way that you view them to make it easier, but the information is exactly the same as what is on a FEMA map. All right, so I'm going to give a little more detail on the proposed floodplain management overlay zoning district. We'll start with some floodplain terms. So the floodplain, as you saw from the mapping, is generally made up of two parts, the floodway and the flood fringe. The floodway is where water moves with a destructive force, and the flood fringe is more like where water piles up and makes up the rest of the floodplain. The entire floodplain is referred to as the 1% annual chance. People used to call this the 100-year floodplain. It doesn't mean it will happen only once every 100 years. It's a 1% chance every year of that happening. The elevation of the floodplain is referred to as the base flood elevation, and throughout this you may see the abbreviation BFE. That's referring to the flood elevation. And then the 0.2% annual chance is the area that is also called the 500-year floodplain. I'll be referring to that also. All right, so what are floodplain management activities? So the mapping that you just saw and the fact that the city hires me to help people interpret that is an example of floodplain management in our map information systems or services. Development review. I review all site plans and building permits for compliance with flood resistant construction standards in the building code and in the UDC. And then our stormwater management reviews. Stormwater management is both for water quality and quantity, and it helps to alleviate some of the effects of development on flooding. Hazard mitigation planning, that I'll explain this a little further later, but every 5 years we put together a hazard mitigation plan. And then actual flood mitigation, where we're removing structures like the fish park that we showed earlier. There was a house there, and I used a FEMA grant to remove that house. And I've taken a few buildings away off of 721 North Main with FEMA money. And then the Allen Creek Railroad Berm project that people might be familiar with, where we just provided an opening in the railroad berm, and as a result, we'll be dropping the flood elevation, taking some structures out of the floodplain and reducing the risk or the flood depth on quite a few other structures. And then we participate in the community rating system. The community rating system is a voluntary incentive-based program that rewards communities for going above and beyond the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. And in return, they provide lower flood insurance rates within the community. So nationwide, the community rating system, currently there's 1,517 communities, which is only less than 1% of all the communities in the United States, but it represents about 7% of the communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. That's because not every community has floodplains, but it does cover 72% of the National Flood Insurance policies. So basically, communities that have a lot of structures in the floodplain tend to join the community rating system. So the system is it's a point system that results in a class rating. And to use us as an example, we're currently a class 6, which you'll see on one side, and then in the middle, and then the points that we have attained to get there on the other side. And the class 6 for us represents a 20% discount on flood insurance within the special flood hazard area or the floodplain. And then there's also a 10% discount if you want to get a flood insurance policy outside of the floodplain, which is something that anybody can do if they want to. So within Michigan, there are only 24 communities in the program, which is 2.25% of the communities in Michigan. And below that, I've listed the number of communities in each class. We at class 6, there's only one other community, city of Vassar, and there's only one other community with a better rating than we currently have, and that is the city of Midland. It's pretty rare for communities to get beyond a 5 because there's thresholds and there's more difficult requirements. And frankly, there are some points that like a coastal community could get that aren't available to us. So it's not terribly likely for us to move much beyond a 5 within the program. This is a list of the points that we get for the activities that the floodplain management activities that we're doing. And then at the end where I list a percent, I've listed the percent of the total points available that we are currently getting. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on one of these, and that is the item 430, higher regulatory standards. And currently, we are only getting 14% of the points available in that particular category. All right, so what is a floodplain management overlay zoning district?
Well, maybe before we get into that, does anybody have any questions about CRS that they want to ask right away? Not seeing anything come in. Oh, yes. Yep, we do have one question. Midland is at level 5, but was recently affected by dams that broke just north of the city. How do the dams in Ann Arbor affect our rating?
They really don't affect our rating very much. Every community in the entire state gets the same amount of points for the state's dam safety program, but the dam itself, I mean, so like along the Huron River, the dam itself actually attenuates flooding. It kind of evens things out. So the result of the dam is that there is kind of less floodplain area. That makes sense. So there are some points in that category for doing dam maintenance and safety activities that I have not pursued. So the dams themselves don't really result in much of a score. And then in Midland, the dams that cause the flooding are actually not in Midland. They're upstream of Midland. They're in different communities.
Okay. Let's see. And then just going back to a question about the maps. There was a question about why didn't we show the maps of the old West Side neighborhood that are of importance to most people on this call. So Anthony, if you don't mind me offering, maybe we can come back to the maps later on and you can show some of the old West Side stuff, if that's okay. Or maybe people can contact you later on if they want you to walk through the maps with them. So we can come back.
I'd be more.
Okay. And then there is a question about the questions that I'm reporting that are not all visible, including some of the homeowners' questions. These are, the question is, are these being held back by the moderator or is there another reason I can't see them? They are not being held back by me. We have to answer them and then I need to push a button to show them all, but I can do that now. And again, these are all going to be posted online as well, but I can show all the questions at the moment just so people can see the questions that were submitted. So I'll do that, and then we'll get back to answering some of them as we get through the presentation. All right, Jerry, I think you can move ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so a floodplain management overlay zoning district is a damage prevention ordinance that establishes higher building standards than the floodplain with the intent to minimize public and private losses due to flood conditions. And the idea of this overlay district comes from the city's 2007 flood mitigation plan, and that these plans are required to be updated every 5 years to be effective. And the reason that for doing a hazard mitigation or flood mitigation plan, it makes you eligible for grant money, like the Allen Creek Berm project. We used FEMA money, like over $3 million of FEMA money. And the reason we're eligible for that is for having these plans. So the overlay zoning district was carried over in the 2012 plan, and then in the 2017 plan, it was fleshed out to much greater detail, and the importance of the recommendation was raised to the highest level, and was identified to start up doing this project in 2017, which we did. Excuse me, in 2019, which we did. All right, what are some of the reasons for doing a floodplain overlay zoning district? So we know from statistics that we have that there's a slightly more vulnerable community in the floodplain, both economically and socially. Changing weather patterns are causing higher risk, in other words, more frequent, larger storms. Rising economic flood damage. It's been documented that nationwide, but particularly in Michigan over the last 30 years, there's been a lot more damage than there has in the 30 years before that. More structures in the floodplain in the future. We know that from modeling that we have done locally, that there are a couple areas where the floodplain should extend beyond the FEMA mapped floodplain. Rising flood insurance rates. That's something that FEMA is working on. They currently have a project going called Risk Rate 2.0 that they're revising the entire rate structure. So we have an opportunity to improve within the community rating system. And also, where the state of Michigan, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, by state law, they prohibit residential construction in the floodway, but that is not applied equally here in Ann Arbor. I'll get into that a little more detail. So the state, I'll refer to EGLE as the state just to make it easier. So the state requires permits for fill or structures within the floodplain, and by state law, they prohibit residential construction in the floodway. However, the state only has jurisdiction where the contributing drainage area is greater than 2 square miles. This map shows the areas circled in red where the state does not have jurisdiction, which represents about 50% of the parcels and 50% of the buildings within the floodplain. So in the areas circled in red, you can build residential in the floodway, and the areas that are not circled in red, you cannot. So it's a disparate regulation for us. Now, one thing to notice from this map is that the 3 branches of Allen Creek that go out to the west are all circled there, and that's pretty much where we have the majority of the structures within the floodplain. There's that area. Here's another map to give you a sense of how many structures are in the floodplain and how much floodplains we have. So the total floodplain, 2.7 square miles, about 10% of the city, 1,169 parcels. And then the chart lists the number of structures by each creek. And you can see the total number of structures currently in the floodplain, 490, and the majority of those are in Allen Creek and its various branches at 373. All right, so higher regulatory standards. The reason they're called higher regulatory standards is because most of these standards already exist in some format, and we're proposing to move to a higher standard. If you use the ladder as an analogy, at the bottom of the ladder, before you on the ground, that would be like no regulations. At the top of the ladder would be completely prohibiting all development within the floodplain. So currently, I would say we're about halfway up the ladder with the current regulations we have, and with this proposal, we're going to be moving up a rung. The source of the proposed changes comes from the Association of State Floodplain Managers. They have a document called No Adverse Impact. It's a toolkit for common sense floodplain management. And the majority of those recommendations have been incorporated into the community rating system, and points are available for these activities. All right, so within Michigan, there is a statewide building code. This is where most of the floodplain regulations currently exist. There's a law that says communities are prohibited from having their own building codes, so we have to use the state building code. And also communities may not regulate to a lower standard. So within the proposal that we have, we can't propose anything that's a lesser standard than the Michigan building code. And also this is why we chose the format of a zoning ordinance, because we are not allowed to change the building code, but we do have authority to change our zoning.
Jerry, if you don't mind pausing just for a moment, there's a question that came in about the ranks. The question is, hello, thank you for taking the time to respond and hold this workshop. I'm a bit confused about the ranks. Will this proposed regulation move us up in rank and therefore allow for more funds for the city from FEMA?
The rank within the community rating system, the numbers go the other way that you would expect. If you're not in the program, you're a 10, and if you're the best in the country, you're a 1. So numerically, I expect if this ordinance is approved as is, we would move from a class 6 to a class 5, which would improve the insurance discount that we get. It doesn't change our eligibility for grants or anything like that. Okay.
Thanks, Jerry.
All right, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things that are in the building code that we really can't change. There have been quite a few questions about the concept of substantial improvement. Substantial improvement is a concept that applies to existing buildings within the floodplain. If someone wants to do a project, apply for permits to change or add on to something on an existing building, there's this threshold in the building code called substantial improvement, and it's basically if the value of the improvements exceed 50% of the market value of the structure, then the floodplain regulations for a new building would apply. In other words, if your project is less than 50% of the market value, then you don't have to comply with the floodplain regulations. And an example of the regulations would be to elevate or floodproof a house. So it's that once you get to that threshold, it's sort of all or nothing. However, there is a exemption for historic structures. And so historic structures can never meet that threshold. You don't, basically when a historic permit on a historic structure comes in, you don't do a substantial improvement calculation because it is exempt from the requirements. So you can continue to maintain and improve. You can't expand, but you can continue to maintain and improve a historic structure in perpetuity and never hit that threshold. The concept of substantial improvement is fairly complex. It's so complex that FEMA has a 174-page manual that assists communities and designers in how to apply this concept.
Jerry, we did have a question come in about the statewide building codes, if you don't mind pausing for that. Is the city saying that it's in its third bullet, this is referring to question on slide 15, that Ann Arbor is now being required to enforce the state building codes in the non-EGLE floodplains, even though it has not been doing so since the current state building codes were adopted in 2015?
There's about 4 questions in that one question. Could you read them one at a time? Because there's some different answers to each of those.
Sure. Is the city saying in its third bullet point that Ann Arbor is now being required to enforce the state building codes in the non-EGLE floodplains?
No, the building code has been in place since December of 1999 and has been enforced since then. The state has jurisdiction and their requirement in state law that prohibits residential is above and beyond the building code. That is a requirement that is not in the building code. That is related to the permitting authority of EGLE, or the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So that prohibition on residential is a requirement outside of the building code. Okay, can you read the next part of the question?
The second part is, even though it has not been doing so since the current state building codes were adopted in 2015.
That's just incorrect. The city has been. We have been applying the building code actually since the state building code since '99, and each of the updates that occurs. Okay.
Okay. There's another question that just came in. Does the state building code requirement currently apply to non-EGLE floodplains in Ann Arbor?
Yes. Yep. Like I said, the building code and EGLE's requirements are separate items. You have to comply with both independently. It's just that the EGLE doesn't have jurisdiction in some areas, so we would apply the building code, but EGLE wouldn't be involved because they don't have jurisdiction.
Okay, and then we do have another question that came in. Historic structures are exempt, but do the requirements relating to the floodplain overlay apply to additions to an original structure that expand the footprint of the entire structure?
Yes, the building code applies, and our zoning code would apply also to an addition. So the exemption for historic district is for the existing historic structure. So if you build an addition onto a historic structure, it would have to be elevated to meet the building code. That's something we have language in the proposed zoning ordinance to clarify that, so that it helps people understand what is expected of them.
And there's a concern that's raised about hearing about the SI requirements for the first time now.
They have actually the substantial improvement requirements are nationwide, part of the National Flood Insurance Program to join it. And so the city joined the National Flood Insurance Program in 1982. So those requirements have been in place and enforced within Ann Arbor since 1982.
And then we have another question. Our home was built in 1913. What is the criteria to meet a historic structure designation? I'm asking, as a historic structure is not allowed to be maintained without having a 50% of property value disclaimer as it relates to maintaining the property.
Brett, do you want to take that one? That's a historic district question.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we would designate a historic district as part of our historic district ordinance. So we have a series of historic districts that have gone through analysis and identified those properties that meet the criteria for inclusion in that district. So the properties within those designated historic districts would meet that test.
And then also related to historic structure, do the repairs that require a building permit count towards substantial improvement limits?
Well, each time a permit is applied for on a historic structure, the process would go like this. You apply for it, I take a look at it, I see that it's in a historic district, I approve it, I move it on, because you don't do a substantial improvement calculation because it's exempt from that process. So as long as there's not something proposed in that building permit that is an addition, or in the case of the new ordinance, there are a few items that would be prohibited, like if someone was proposing a walkout basement, and if they're going to create a walkout basement or a new egress into a basement, we wouldn't want that because it will make the basement flood more. So as long as there's not something like that proposed, that building permit would be issued, and it would become irrelevant to the substantial improvement calculation because you're not ever doing that calculation.
Relative to the conversation about substantial improvement, one of the questions that was submitted earlier and resubmitted during this webinar is, could the city please share the exact definition of substantial improvement it plans to include in the ordinance? We are not including that definition because we don't want, our intention is not to create a new definition. Substantial improvement, as Jerry has indicated, has existed in our building code for some time. There are several different building codes by which a particular project could be reviewed and approved for construction and ultimately inspected. Those codes have definitions of substantial improvement. So depending on which of those codes the work is being conducted under, that is the governing definition of substantial improvement. The intention with the overlay district is not to, in fact, create a distinct definition that would potentially be in conflict with that, but rather rely on those existing definitions depending on the applicable code that would apply.
Yep.
And hopefully, just to read these out loud, hopefully that gets to some of the questions, other questions that are coming in about that, which relates back to the concern about hearing about the SISD requirements for the first time now, if it has been enforced in the EGLE floodplains for the past 20 years. And then another one that says state building code flood provisions enforced for 20 years in non-EGLE floodplains in Ann Arbor, substantial damage provisions as well. Is there anything more to add, Jerry and Brett, to that?
One of the questions included the number 20 years. It's actually much longer, since 1982.
And then to clarify, and this is, Jerry, correct me if I'm wrong, this was something that I actually was learning about. So the substantial improvement in a time period are, just to be clear, is a proposal that is changing right now.
Yep.
So currently the substantial improvement is not limited by a time period. Is that correct, Jerry?
Correct. Thanks. That's actually the next slide I was going to get to in the presentation. Great. So
yeah.
Do that. So in the building code, there is no time frame associated with the substantial improvement, and there's a concern within the floodplain regulatory industry that people would try to just take one project and split it up into multiple permits. And so as a result, within the community rating system, there are points available if communities apply a cumulative time frame to that. And so currently, since there's no identified time frame, currently staff looks at it as an unlimited period. So we already apply cumulative improvement, but we receive no credit or points for that within the community rating system. So we are proposing to calculate substantial improvement over a 10-year period. This will allow the minimum amount of points within the community rating system. You have to calculate over at least 5 years, and then you can get the maximum points by going over 10 years. And like I was saying, this is already how we do this administratively, but it's not recognized. So you're trying to codify our current administrative policy.
And then we did have one more question come in about the historic district. Just to clarify, does that mean if our structure is in a designated historic district, we do not have to apply specifically for that historic structure designation for our home?
Yeah, so that's part of that would be part of the review of the work being conducted on that structure. As part of that, we would verify if it is meeting that requirement, and then that's how the review would be conducted. It doesn't require sort of a separate legislative decision. It's a verification of existing status that's conducted as part of that review.
And then another historic district question. Our home is in the historic district and located in the floodway. Based on the regulation, we would be able to, we'd be able to action that is on pillars as long as our home is above a certain level.
The current code would allow that. There's, I'll get into this a little bit later in the presentation, but as long as there was a hydrologic study showing that that does not cause a rise in the flood elevation, that's potentially allowed currently. That is one of the goals of this ordinance, to prohibit such things. We're trying to limit what gets built in the floodplain, and so we're proposing to not allow additions to structures within the floodway, which I'll explain later.
Okay, all right. Why don't, maybe it's best to let you get further in your presentation, and maybe some of these questions will be answered, and then we'll get back to more questions.
Okay. Within the substantial improvement, there's this term market value, and there have been quite a few questions about this. So market value is not defined in the building code. We are proposing within the zoning ordinance to define that as the true cash value as determined by the city assessor. And the reason for doing this is to utilize the expertise of the city assessor and to make this transparent for permit holders so they know how we're going to calculate this. And if someone disagrees with the city assessor, they can always appeal to the city assessor. There's an appeal process that's already established. And this basically will codify the city's administrative practice. I've been the city's floodplain manager for over 30 years, and it's exactly how we've implemented this the entire time I've worked at the city. So this is kind of just codifying our administrative practice to make it clear to people how we're going to do this so they're not surprised. With that out, I have two other little sections of the presentation just to explain the current regulations within the floodway, then the flood fringe, and then proposed. And I'll do one at a time, floodway, then flood fringe. So Heather, do we want to answer any more questions before I start doing that?
We do have 3 questions that came in. So yeah, if this is a good place to pause. The first question is about slide 17, cumulative substantial improvements. A 10-year accumulation period is far too draconian approach to make sure that single projects are not split into multiple permit applications in order to avoid substantial improvement thresholds. Sarasota, Florida, for instance, identifies what it would consider to be splitting or phasing tactics. For example, permits for incomplete work that would result in a structure that can't be occupied without additional work, multiple and/or consecutive permits, such as applying for plumbing, electrical, air conditioning, and building permits at close to the same time, etc. And then empowers building department staff to aggregate these separate permit costs, but not others. Isn't this approach more reasonable and much fairer to the homeowners?
Well, the goal of the National Flood Insurance Program and the substantial improvement is to eventually require buildings to be elevated or flood-proofed. So from a floodplain management standpoint, I do not agree with the items listed in the question of being draconian or anything. While it's may sound like a long period of time, this is what is recommended by flood management professionals, and it's what is recommended in the CRS.
And then another question, unlimited accumulation period being used by city and formally not codified. How legally enforceable is that? And which cities in the country which other cities in the country are doing that?
Since it's something that is recommended by CRS, there are definitely communities doing this. I mean, when communities join the CRS manual kind of suggests higher standards that a community could consider, and since they provide points for it. So there's definitely communities that have a time frame. I would say that there are quite a few communities within the CRS that have a time frame for the cumulative calculation.
And then one more before we move on. This is a question on slide 18, market value definition. FEMA's own substantial improvement, substantial damage desk, reference section 4.5, clearly states that the use of tax assessed values to determine the market value of a property has limitations that, if not addressed and accounted for, can produce erroneous estimates of market value. Most NFIP CRS communities have therefore adopted definitions or processes in the ordinances that allow for the use of fair market value appraisals conducted by state licensed appraisers. Whatever the expertise of the city's assessors, it is not primarily focused on developing a current fair market value of an individual property, and the tax estimate may quickly become outdated. Why are you not recognizing FEMA's concerns about tax assessed values and allowing fair market appraisals?
If someone wants to do an appraisal and submit it to the city assessor, they can do that. That is allowed within the city assessor's process.
And we also, I would also add that we wanted to be sure to provide a mechanism that wasn't necessary. So that wasn't a requirement or an additional cost, for example, to be covered on a project.
Yeah, if we were to require people to do an appraisal before getting a permit, it takes months to get a good appraisal. I've hired appraisers to do appraisals related to structure removal. And it costs several $1,000s and takes several months to get an accurate, good appraisal. I mean, that would be a huge burden. So basically the starting point of the process is using the city assessor's numbers that they have on file already. If someone disagrees with that, they can appeal to the assessor, and they want to take the time and hire an appraisal, they can do that and work that out with the assessor. And when they're done with that process, they can come back to me to move on with the building permit process. So as I've mentioned, I've been doing this as the city's floodplain manager for 30 years, and this issue has not come up in 30 years of using market value that's on file with the city assessor.
And then a follow-up question. Tell us about the city assessor process. Other cities allow owner to choose between stipulations of assessed values and FMVs.
I personally don't have expertise in that area, which is one of the reasons that we rely on the assessor. I don't think I would be able to answer that question.
Yeah, we could try to provide some follow-up on that when we post the other information as well. I would echo that. That's why we're relying on the assessor. They are trained to perform appraisals and conducting their responsibilities, and that's why we want them to be making those calls instead of floodplain coordinators or planners.
And then another assessor question. The assessor's office only changes appraisals once a year in March. Is that timely appeal?
If someone was working with the assessor and came to an agreement, the assessor would let me know what the result was, and then we would be able to move ahead with the building process. But the actual assessment only changes once a year. So it may take a few months for the assessor to catch up with the change, but we could move ahead with the building. I can recall one time working through something like that with the assessor. It was unrelated to a building permit, but it was a building in the floodplain.
Okay, thanks, Jerry.
Should we move on?
Yep, yep.
Okay, let's go through what the current requirements in the floodway, what they are. So in the floodway where the state has jurisdiction, so that map that I showed, the areas that were not circled in red, the state prohibits residential construction in the floodway. In the other parts of the floodway, where the state does not have jurisdiction, currently you can build non-residential structures as long as they're elevated or flood-proof to 1 foot above the 1% annual chance flood elevation, or the base flood elevation. And then any development within the floodway requires hydrologic studies to show that there's not a rise in flood elevation caused by the activity. The proposed ordinance within the floodway, we are proposing no new structures with the exception of redevelopment, which I'll explain a little further on the next slide. We're proposing to prohibit additions, no new residential uses. That's where we'd be applying what's already required in the state jurisdiction floodplains equally in the other parts of the floodplain. We'd also like to prohibit critical facilities, structures without foundations. That would be like a shed. And no accessory structures, and no parking where the depth is greater than 2 feet. And that's because cars move when there's a destructive, or there's a flow greater than 2 feet. And the car becomes destructive to other things. So the redevelopment that I mentioned. So one of the difficult things in writing a code like this is that there are already buildings in the floodplain. And if you just simply say you can't develop in the floodplain at all, then the buildings that are there would just remain there and not be improved in a way of making them safer. So we wanted to allow those buildings to be improved in a safer way. So we are proposing to allow redevelopment as long as the redevelopment does not include residential uses, is not a critical facility, is not larger than the footprint of the existing building in the floodway. You could have, the building could be bigger out of the floodway. If it's a new building, in other words, if you're going to totally tear a building down and rebuild the building, that it be placed on the lot to have the most minimum impact on the floodway and the floodplain. And of course, a hydrologic study would have to be provided, like is already required. And we would require that the building be elevated to 1 foot above the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. That's the 1 foot above the 500 year, and we would not allow for flood proofing. So I mentioned this elevation above the 0.2% annual chance. The reason for doing this is it acknowledges climate change, because we know from past records that over the next 50 years, we can expect what we currently call the 0.2%. That will become what we call the 1% flood elevation in the future. The building code currently requires this type of elevation for critical facilities. And this is becoming more common in coastal communities and some other communities like Austin and Fort Collins. And it also only adds about 1 foot to the elevation. So earlier, Tony showed you some cross sections, and here's another one, a typical cross section in Allen Creek. And it's maybe a little hard to read, but I'll interpret it that the two horizontal lines at the top of this graph are the 1% flood elevation and then the 0.2%, and consistently through this section they are 1 foot apart, or approximately 1 foot apart, and that's typical of almost all the floodplains within Ann Arbor. There's some minor exceptions, but there aren't many. So how much does it cost to elevate buildings higher? This chart here, or this slide here, explains the cost of a couple different styles of elevation, and that gives an example of elevating a typical 2,000 square foot house 2 feet above the BFE, which is exactly what we're proposing. Although the state building code already requires you to be 1 foot above, so we're requiring you to go 1 foot above that. But in this particular example, if you were going 2 feet more than required, it would cost about $4,000, or roughly a little over $2,000 per foot. And in this particular example, when you take into account the flood insurance savings, the payback on that is only 3.3 years, and then over the course of a 30-year mortgage, you would actually save $37,000 in insurance. So the cost that we're asking within this ordinance to go 1 foot higher, so say that's going to be roughly $2,000 for a typical house to go 1 foot higher. You would get that back in a year or two of flood insurance rates.
So there was a couple related questions to that, and I just want to stop there for a minute and make sure we're all on the same page. So, Jerry, we are not adding any new structures that would have to elevate based on building code requirements. We're not. This is in fact not adding properties to that, but rather when you are elevating, this ordinance would require you to elevate a foot higher than what the current building code requires. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
The requirements already exist to elevate or floodproof, and this would just require that you elevate or floodproof 1 foot higher than the current code.
And there are questions about, do we know how many properties that this would impact, that for which that would be very expensive or technically challenging? And I guess the short answer to that is no, we don't have that detailed information. This is very much, I think, a great example of that one rung up the ladder where the requirement to elevate already exists. And we believe that if if the work is going to be conducted that requires that type of intervention occurs, then let's take it, the ordinance is required to go a foot higher than what the building code requires. And so that, I just want to be clear that we're not necessarily applying this to more structures. We are increasing the elevation required, and we recognize that there is an additional cost for that. And that's the policy trade-off here, is that, and we don't have the specific knowledge of how much it would specifically cost for every structure by which it would apply. We are estimating approximately about an additional $2,000 based on that example that Jerry was providing.
That's exactly right, Brent. Thank you.
And we do have a question. It looks like you're getting close to the end of your presentation, so maybe we'll come back to this. We do have another question that came in.
Yeah, but I'll go through this slide, and then I can move on to the flood fringe, and then I'll actually be done with the presentation.
Okay.
So this slide just compares the current regulations to the proposed regulations in the areas where the state has jurisdiction. And so you can see currently residential is prohibited, and that would remain the same. And then basically non-residential, we would be requiring that you go 1 foot higher to elevate above the 0.2%. And where you can build critical facilities currently, we would like to prohibit those. And they currently would have to be elevated, but there's just doesn't seem to be any need to put a critical facility in the floodway. And then we'd also prohibit a couple other things like house trailers, structures without foundations, new accessory structures, and new parking where the depth is greater than 2 feet. And now where the state does not have jurisdiction, this slide, the chart is exactly the same as the chart on the page before, with the exception of the first line across the top, where currently you can build residential in the floodway if it's elevated and you have a hydrologic study, and we would like to prohibit residential. And then the second part of it, we're saying we would not allow any new structures unless it's for redevelopment. In that case, we go 1 foot higher by elevating above the 0.2%. And with that, I can move on to flood fringe unless we want to break for some more questions.
Yeah, we do have 2 questions, so let's pause and answer those. How is the city balancing the desire to improve FEMA flood rank with their vision to increase downtown population density? Because with the proposed regulation, homes can't grow additions, so it will inevitably limit families living downtown.
I'll take a start at this, and Jerry, if there's anything you want to add. This has been a conversation that we've had a similar version of this a lot at the staff level, and I guess I'd like to hopefully this addresses it, to use it as a bit of an example. This proposed regulation is very much an incremental regulation that is intended to obviously limit development in the floodway, and to ensure that any development that does happen in the flood fringe as well to be done in a very thoughtful and safe manner that helps to protect property and people. This is obviously a bit of a policy decision and spectrum for the city to consider. This proposed ordinance recognizes, as Jerry indicated, that we have a lot of structures that are in these geographies, and it provides some exception and protection to allow those to exist and to be invested in over the long term without undue further adverse impacts to the floodplain, because we want that investment to occur. We want them to be improved. We want them ideally to be fixed or improved in such a way to help improve the functionality of these areas of the city. We could certainly take it farther, and the city could take a policy decision that says, contrary to what we would say now, we are not aggressively trying to eliminate all structures out of the floodplain in the city. We have taken some steps to do that on a voluntary basis through acquisition of property and sort of a targeted basis. But this ordinance puts a bit of stake in the ground and saying, no, we're recognizing that we are a developed community, and part of that being a developed community has properties in these areas. And we're going to provide some specific protections to allow those to continue. And so this question, I think, really gets to that balance, is that it is possible that this will have a limiting impact on the ability to expand some properties. And that might compromise the ability of some houses to expand beyond what they could otherwise under previous regulations if this is adopted. But we think that this is a very responsible balance to try and provide some improved functionality of these floodplains, some benefits in the way of discounts to insurance for those properties that are impacted by the floodplain, and allowing some potential investment of those structures that already exist. But undoubtedly, it is a trade-off. This, I think, is a very thoughtful and balanced way to sort of straddle both of these worlds. It would be it would be an appropriate conversation to say, no, we should go more extreme to say we want to allow more building in the floodplain. That's going to compromise our CRS rating. It's going to probably ultimately compromise the functionality of these floodplains. We could go to the other extreme and say, nope, we should aggressively be trying to remove all these buildings out of the floodplain. And we're doing neither. We think that this is quite an incremental approach to improve obviously our rating, the functionality of these floodplains, and try to find that balance. But I just want to acknowledge that question is that that kind of question is at the core of this balance.
Well put, Brett.
Thank you. And then there's two other questions. Sorry, did you have something more to say, Jerry?
No.
Okay. The other question is, our question was actually about the all-in cost of elevating an existing non-elevated occupied structure above the FPE, expressed in dollars per square foot of building footprint.
So not the incremental cost, but what would be the cost to elevate to the current building code requirements?
That's what I understand.
I haven't gathered that information because it's a current code requirement, and I was focusing on the changes that we were proposing.
Jerry, do we have any examples in the community that we might be able to post, just at least for reference points?
Yeah, if you would like, I could move ahead to a couple examples and come back to where I'm at now in the presentation.
Yeah, that sounds great. Or maybe that's some supplemental information we could even provide.
Yeah, let me just bump ahead to, I have a couple examples here. Yeah, here's a house on 209 Murray that was elevated. It wasn't elevated very high, as you can see, but it is elevated 1 foot above it's actually about 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation. This was done voluntarily, and when I say elevated, I mean they removed their basement. They filled it in. And the motivation was flood insurance. And if I remember right, the owner said they went from somewhere around $3,000 a year to about $300 a year by elevating the structure. I don't have the cost, but here's an example of someone doing it voluntarily. And I mean, they looked at the long-term cost of flood insurance and you know, did a conscious calculation that they could get their money back from this effort, you know, within a number of years that was acceptable to them. If you wanted the details of it, I've got here, you know, how high they elevated, and comparing that to the proposed code elevation. They would have actually had to elevate about 4 inches or 0.3 feet higher than they went to meet the proposed code. Then here's a house on 500 Maple Ridge that also did a voluntary elevation. This one's, when I took these pictures, they weren't quite done, still under construction. And here that they elevated they've elevated more than 1 foot above the flood elevation, and so that this one a little bit. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide here. Oh, this is the one though. This is where they would have had to go 4 inches higher to meet the proposed code. Yeah, to give you some other examples on the commercial side, it's fairly typical for commercial to when you're going, if you have to elevate, why not elevate far enough to park underneath it? And that's the case with the condo section of Liberty Lofts. They elevated to be above parking. They're way above what the proposed code would be. This was a voluntary elevation for the purpose of not having high flood insurance. Here's a structure next to the fish park at 410 First, where they elevated above parking. I've got a graphic here showing they elevated to be above parking. They were 4 feet above the base flood elevation. Current code is 1 foot above. We're proposing 2 feet above, so this would have still been 2 feet above what the proposed code is. So there's a couple examples of elevation. I know I don't have costs, but oh, Heather, you're muted, and Brett, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself because my dog was chewing loudly next to me. The question is about the Murray House. And wouldn't the Murray House have to be elevated again with the new standards?
Well, it's a historic structure, so it's exempt from the requirements. So no, it would not have to be elevated again. But if it were simply, if you're just comparing it to code, it gives you a good example. They would have had to go a few inches higher to meet the proposed code.
And then a couple more questions/comments, and I'll read them both. On cost to elevate, we are looking for Ann Arbor market cost similar to the information that FEMA provided in table 3-3 of homeowners retrofitting guide. And then following that, the bottom line on all in cost on elevating, the city doesn't actually know what compliance cost it is imposing on homeowners to elect to stay and invest. Is this correct? We definitely need to follow up with the FEMA table in the retrofit guide updated for Ann Arbor is what we need to know.
As I stated before, I've not gathered that information because that's already required by code, and we're trying to focus on the code changes that are proposed.
And then there's a question, is there a simple way to determine what the BFE is at our property?
Yes, that is one of the things that when Tony was showing you the map, to determine the flood elevation, you read that from the cross sections that are available on our flood mapping tool.
And you can use the contours that are provided as a base resource and estimate to do that determination. So both the profiles allow you to estimate, and so do the topographic contours that are provided to you as well. You can of course go have a survey done, but these are some free and relied upon resources available to you right now.
Yep. And I would say that surveyors and engineers that fill out elevation certificates,
Use our map.
they use our map. They use the same resources, exactly. They just have more experience at reading the maps. That's the only difference.
So we're when we get some time later, I can go to your property with you and we can take a look. Just an example if you want, depending on the time.
So there's no more questions about costs coming in right now. So maybe we carry on and finish up the presentation, and then we get back to some of the main questions that were asked.
Okay. So now I'll go over the regulations that currently exist in the flood fringe. So in the flood fringe, currently you can build residential, but it would have to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And you can also build non-residential, which would have to be elevated or flood-proof to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. We're proposing within the flood fringe that we restrict critical facilities, say we're not going to build any critical facilities, no structures without foundations, limit storage, and then require elevation to go 1 foot higher to be 1 foot above the 0.2% annual chance instead of the 1%. And here's a chart just showing that comparison of that. So currently you can build residential 1 foot above the 1%, going 1 foot higher to be above the 0.2%. Non-residential, you can elevate or flood proof above the 1%. We would like to go 1 foot higher to require that to be above the 0.2. Critical facilities currently would have to be elevated above the 0.2%. We'd like to prohibit those. And just along those lines, like I said, I've worked here for 30 years. There's never been a critical facility proposed within the floodplain. So this is just some easy points within the community rating system that we can get by codifying something that's not happening anyway. And then we'd also like to prohibit house trailers and new structures that are not on foundations. And that is the end of the presentation, other than mentioning some of the benefits that we get from this. The benefits are to improve safety and welfare, reduce loss of life and property, save money and resources necessary for emergency response, particularly from the city, provide a clearer permit process. The state regulations will be applied more consistently since we have 2 different areas of floodplain right now. And then potentially lower flood insurance rates by a better rating in the community rating system. With that, I can just leave it on this and we can continue answering questions.
We do have a new question that came in. When elevating a home, can an ingress-egress window be added?
And that is something that is very problematic. So let me just talk about ingress and egress windows right now for just a minute, separate from elevation. Because of flood insurance and flood insurance rates, some houses within the floodplain are being bought up by landlords to turn it into rental. And they're always trying to increase the number of units within the building. And so we've had a few where they're trying to put bedrooms in basements in the floodplain. To put a bedroom in the basement, the building code requires an egress window. Well, the idea of putting an egress window in the floodplain is just asking for the basement to flood. You're putting a vector in for the water to get to the basement. So we think that's a very bad idea. And so that is an item that we're proposing to prohibit within the floodplain, is to put egress windows that are below the flood elevation. Regardless of someone who's elevating or whatnot, that is has been problematic for us already.
And a related question, Jerry, in the fringe, what about other prohibited uses? Grade level doors, windows, toilets, etc.
Toilets are a problem too. That's another item that we're proposing to prohibit, is new toilet fixtures below the flood elevation. And the reason is because during a flood, they basically flow until the flood goes away, and they overwhelm or can assist in overwhelming our sanitary sewer system. So that's another example of another item that we're proposing to restrict. Doors, no. Well, I would have to get back to the wording of it. Depends on what part of the floodplain we're talking about.
Okay. Okay, those are the, oh, there's another one in the fringe.
Yeah, so putting an access door into, like if you're elevating a structure, obviously all the doors would be above the flood elevation. If you're doing some sort of improvement that is not a substantial improvement, I still would want you to install additional ways for the structure to flood. So that is an example of another thing that we would like to prohibit, is putting new access openings below the flood elevation.
So will existing prohibited uses be grandfathered?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to give it a second to see if any other new questions come in. So we have about 20 minutes left with the scheduled meeting. So what I would propose we do is maybe we go back to any of these questions that were submitted by the Old West Side homeowners. Maybe if somebody from that group wants to suggest a specific question that they really want to go back to. I think some of the things were probably answered through the presentation and the discussion, but if there's anything that anybody wants to really go back to and talk about, maybe submit that right now. And then maybe we take some time to talk about next steps. So Brett, maybe you can jump in and talk about that and what the process is about how this goes to the Planning Commission, and then what happens with that. And then if we have time, going back to the maps with Tony and doing something on the Old West Side. So if that sounds good to everybody, I think that's maybe the plan for the next 20 minutes or so.
Great.
So anybody from the Old West Side homeowners, or is there something that, a topic that you want to go back to that you'd like to talk about?
So Jerry, a question's been added about substantial damage process for both historic and non-historic structures. So what would happen in the event of a substantial damage to a structure either within or without? And I'm presuming this would be a structure in at least the flood fringe, potentially the floodway.
Yeah, so in the flood fringe, if a structure is substantially damaged, which is a very similar definition as substantial improvement, the 50% of the market value threshold, to rebuild that structure, it would have to comply with the flood resistant construction standards, in other words, be elevated. And the floodway is a little more complicated because if you're currently in an area where the state has jurisdiction and residential is prohibited and that structure is damaged, it's questionable whether or not you would be able to get a permit from the state to rebuild since residential is prohibited. In the areas where the state does not have jurisdiction, it would be allowed. But with the proposed language, since we're proposing to prohibit residential, if a building in the floodway was a residential building and damaged beyond 50% of its market value, that building would not be able to be rebuilt.
Okay, there was also a question a couple times about where will this presentation be available? It will be available on the city's website, specifically at www.a2gov.org/floodplains. So both the previous webinar is already posted there, and then this one will be, I would hope, hopefully by the end of this week. So I'm going to live with that. Yeah, we'll have it posted up on that website by the end of the day on Friday.
And that website should be showing up in the answers to the questions. And I do want to double check with everybody if you're seeing all the questions listed too. All the, I think it's 17 questions that the homeowners, the West Side homeowners submitted.
And the website's listed on this page right here too.
Oh, thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
And so there is a request, I think, to talk more about substantial damage process for both historical and non-historical structures.
I think that's what Jerry just covered.
What's that?
That's what Jerry just covered.
Okay. I just wanted to double check if there was anything more. So if the person submitted that, if there's anything more that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else that anybody else wants to go back to?
I don't know if we want to just provide a brief window here for any of the callers as well. If any of those callers want to press *9, we'll probably try to limit it to just a minute or two to make sure we can get through everything. But if you'd like to, if you're unable to submit a question via the chat, please use that function. Seeing none.
Yep, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Should we-
Jerry, if the lines on the map can be viewed as 100% accurate, then my parking lot is in the floodway and my commercial building is in the fringe. Which set of rules would apply?
So the lines on the map are, floodplain regulation is a complicated beast. FEMA rules are complicated. The floodway lines that are on the maps are regulatory, and that's what we use, the exact lines that are on the map. So if whatever part of the property falls within the floodway, you have to follow the floodway requirements. The rest of the floodplain, the outer boundary of it, those lines that are on the map are approximate. And the flood regulations actually are based on the flood elevation and not the boundaries on the flood map. So to determine exactly where the flood boundary is on your property, you would need to figure out what the flood elevation is and compare that to actual like surveyed elevation. You can get a very good idea from what Tony was saying. We have 1 foot contours on our city website, so you can get a really good idea of where they're at. But like in the process of development, it would require a survey in the actual flood elevation to determine where that line is.
And again, that's part of the intention of that 50-foot buffer, is so that we are making sure that we are encompassing the entire floodplain when we're considering these regulations. So that sort of triggers, even though that gives us a little bit of wiggle room to make sure that the actual elevations on the ground don't differ from the published map boundaries.
Exactly.
And we do have somebody with their hand raised on the phone, so I'm gonna allow you to talk now. So the person with the phone number ending in 464, you can go ahead and talk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I hope this question makes sense. I know that the floodplain or the flood elevation and the extent of the floodplain itself changes according to how many structures are, put in it or taken out of it. And so my question is, like what was done at 208 Murray, how many like homes, and I'm talking about the Allen Creek area right now, the Allen Creek floodplain, how many homes would it take to elevate them, to floodproof them to this new standard to affect the boundary of the floodplain or the baseline flood elevation? Does that make sense, my question?
The question makes sense, but I think the assumption is kind of incorrect. So adding and subtracting houses from the floodplain won't really have as much impact as you would think, and not enough to change the flood boundaries. And in fact, the flood boundaries are only changed by FEMA when they do map updates, and the last one we had was 2012, or by making changes to the grades under permits and submitting requests to FEMA to change the flood boundaries. So FEMA can only change the flood boundaries, we can't, and so they don't change along with each building that goes in and out of the floodplain. All of that would get encompassed into the process of doing a new map, because when a new map is done, they base it on the current conditions. So if FEMA decides in a couple of years it's time to redo our flood maps, they'll take into account all of the building and building removals over the past whatever 20 years. But the maps don't change incrementally like that from individual projects.
mean, that's also part of the reason the inventory of the map amendments are kept and the elevation certificates are kept. So at the time a new modernization of the mapping's done, all those resources are available in addition to Army Corps of Engineers surveyors doing all the surveying as well to redefine the floodplain boundaries. That's what happened in 2012.
There's a couple questions that are quasi-related. First, when and how will affected property owners eventually learn about all these changes? Apart from the mandatory notice requirements, would the significance of this effort and the need for property owner education not have argued for notification by postcard? 5 years ago, city council said a robust and painstaking outreach was warranted, even the Parks and Rec Department sent us a postcard 2 weeks ago about upgrade playground equipment at West Park. So to be clear, we are not sending notices to all property owners that are impacted. That's done because we're following state law and our typical ordinance protocol. Once a certain quantity of properties is exceeded, we send the notice out more generally. Typically, we send notice, we publish it in the paper of record. We certainly publish it on the city's website. And send it voluntarily to neighborhood associations that have registered with the city. In this case, both particularly for these 2 webinars, we've taken a much more expansive role, and I'm glad to see so many people have learned about it. We have tried to use all the city's social media channels and press releases and the like to get a robust word out. And based on attendance here in the previous session, I think we've had some success in that regard. As it relates to what the next steps are, there's also a question about when the vote is expected to be. As this is a proposed amendment to the city's Unified Development Code, any such amendments are required to receive a recommendation or review by the Planning Commission, and then those are ultimately forwarded to City Council. The Planning Commission has already had 1 public hearing on this. They asked for this additional webinar, which we're glad to provide. They are reconsidering the proposed ordinance on October 20th at their regular meeting agenda. Depending if it were to be adopted, either as presented or with any modifications, I would anticipate then it would progress to City Council in December, in January. I say both those months because any ordinance amendments at the City Council requires 2 readings, the first reading, and then the second reading is accompanied by a public hearing. So next steps for feedback on it would be certainly at the public hearing on October 20th at the Planning Commission, and then the subsequent public hearing at the City Council as well.
There is another question that came in. You mentioned that the railroad burn positively impacts the floodway. When will that impact be reflected in the floodway boundaries?
We will be submitting a letter of map revision to FEMA probably at the end of this month, and it could take up to 6 months for them to respond. So I would say it's safe to say about 6 months from now. But the way that will be reflected on the maps is exactly what Tony was showing. There'll be a star on the map probably for each of the properties affected by it. So, because FEMA doesn't put out a new map, they just put out this revision. Until a process takes place to change all of the maps within the city, it'll just be that letter of map revision that we have to keep track of. So, like I said, we'll basically be putting a star on all the properties that are affected by the change, there's about 30 properties affected.
And then going back to the process, was it not the case that the first public hearing at Planning Commission was postponed?
Yes, it was postponed to October 20th. So the public hearing, the public hearing was held, and then another public hearing, the public hearing will be continued on October 20th.
Okay. And then we got a similar question on the same vein. Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left then. Are there any questions that people really want answered regarding any of the topics, or do you think we have time to go back to the maps? maybe we start, Tony, if you don't mind, kind of pulling up the maps again. And then if any other questions come in, I'll read them off.
Thank you.
Heather, we've got another caller.
Oh, great. Well, I think that might have been the same caller from before.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
yeah, I'll just double check. This was caller with the last 3 digits, 464. Did you have another question?
Well, it's a follow-up. Jerry, thank you for answering my question, but I didn't mean literally when FEMA changes its maps. My question was functionally, in reality, how many properties like that would have to be flood-proofed and elevated to affect the floodplain? Not when it would be actually recorded in the map, but in real life, like in real life, functionally, how many, just ballpark, of those properties that are currently in the floodplain would need to be elevated to have some kind of perceptible effect on the actual baseline flood elevation and boundary of the floodplain?
It would take a massive effort, and I don't even know if we would ever get there to the point where it would affect the floodplain that much. So the city has a stormwater model for each of the branches of every creek. And we have the ability within that model to do like scenarios. And we put a scenario into the model that said, it wasn't about taking structures out, but it was like if every property in the city redeveloped and on commercial met the city's stormwater requirements, and every residential parcel put in a rain garden, and all of U of M got redeveloped and put detention in, what would the floodplains look like? And particularly within Allen Creeks, because of the amount of impervious area, there was very little change in the floodplain boundaries. So I would say more or less the floodplain boundaries are unlikely to change a lot unless it is from inaccuracies in the mapping effort currently. Like if they, so we actually have better contour information than was used to generate these maps. So stuff like that would change the maps. But I think it's safe to say that we can't really build ourselves out of the floodplain. Not through removing structures, not through stormwater management outside of it. We're always going to have a floodplain, so the risks are going to continue.
So in short, the floodplain boundaries in the city are probably more determined by what's happening outside of them than what's happening inside of them.
Yes.
Because of the developed nature of the city, that is the amount of development, the amount of impervious, the state of our amount of property that is protected with stormwater systems or not protected with stormwater systems, that is much more determinant on the boundaries of the floodplain than structures within it. However, this regulation and the applicable building codes that already exist that we keep referencing are more so about protecting those structures that are in that area and impacted by that phenomenon.
Yep.
Thank you.
There's a particular area, somebody wants to visualize, I'm happy to do that. I'm just trying to show again some of the functionality we covered almost 2 hours ago with the amendments and the map changes and the profiles right here. Just to let you know, everything we spoke of is available to you for free.
Brett, there is a question about the draft of the ordinance that's posted. It looks like the ordinance, it's the first draft that's posted. And so Planning Commission saw a second version that never was posted. When will the version to be proposed for adoption be available?
No later than when the packet goes out. Jerry and I can work to get that posted on the website actually, though, prior to that. To be clear, the second draft refers to a series of very minor, more housekeeping type of amendments By one way of example, this ordinance specifies a specific city department. We care more about the qualifications of the person performing this review. So it's a series of sort of administrative changes, but we'll get that posted shortly. And it'll definitely be reflected with the Planning Commission packet. For those that are particularly interested in this, it will be on the agenda October 20th. So mark that on your calendars. Apart from that, if you're ever interested in Planning Commission petitions, be it this or other ones, you can always sign up for the city's GovDelivery listserv, which is called Planning Updates. And then you'll receive notification of all planning agendas upon their publication, so you can see what is being discussed at that board.
Okay, so we just have 4 minutes left. So if you have a burning question, please do submit it. Otherwise, I guess we can just leave it at look forward to October 20th, where this will be in front of the Planning Commission. And then also that we'll have this posted up on the website, this recording posted up on the website by the end of this week, as well as the questions and answers to the questions that were submitted by the Old West Side homeowners. Is there anything else, Jerry and Brett or Tony, that you want to share before we leave?
Good questions and discussions. Jerry is very knowledgeable in this, so as he referenced in his presentation, you can always email and ask any particular questions about his property. Generally, the city is here to assist you in achieving your goals. Obviously, we have regulations, we have building codes that have to be applied, but if you have questions, reach out. We're happy to talk with you about your property, what the limitations might be. Hopefully the new map, thank you very much, Tony. I think that's going to be a great tool and much more usable for everybody to sort of investigate on their own. But whether it's through this ordinance process before or independently, just don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to provide whatever information we can. Jerry, we're fortunate to have somebody with his experience and frankly the resources to dedicate somebody to this role in the city, an important role. And so I would encourage everybody to take advantage of it.
We do have one question that came in. If after a 50% damage event, if we are still able to elevate our home, does that mean we can implement those changes and would not have to demolish or abandon the home?
The answer to that is yes.
Just yes.
I think
Anything?
so. There was a few qualifiers in there, so but yeah, if the house is damaged beyond 50% of the market value, then the code would require, even currently would require the house be elevated. Under the new code, would be required to elevate 1 foot higher. But yeah, that type of scenario would kick the requirement, the code requirement in that substantial improvement is related to substantial damage directly. So that is what kicks you into the elevation. There was a question earlier from earlier in the day that we answered. If that were a historic building, that might be a slightly different scenario. In elevating the structure, you would, so historic, we mentioned historic structures are exempt. However, if the building is damaged to the point where it is not considered historic anymore, and that's a gray line. Depends on how the building is damaged as whether it is not considered historic anymore. But if it somehow loses its historic designation, then it would have to be elevated. That exemption wouldn't exist. But as long as it maintains its historic designation, it could be rebuilt. So let's say that the interior of a house burned up in a fire and it destroyed 70% of the interior, but all the facade and everything remained. I would imagine that would still be a historic structure, look like one and all that. And most likely you could rebuild it without elevating because of the exemption. It's only if it somehow loses its historic district designation that it would be required to be elevated.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Well, it's 1 minute after 7, so I think we should bring this meeting to a close and let people get on with their lives. Again, as Brett mentioned, our staff is available for questions. You know, everybody's welcome to carry on this conversation and ask more questions outside of this meeting with our staff, so please do so, especially before the meeting on the 20th, so that you can have all of your questions answered before then and go into that meeting being well informed. So I guess with that, thank you everybody for attending this. We appreciate your time and talking over this issue. Anything else, Brett?
Yeah,
Jared,
just
Tony?
one last item in advance. If you just like to share comments or feedback on the proposed ordinance as well, feel free to share that as well. That'll be shared with the Planning Commission. An easy way to share that is at planning@a2gov.org. So again, feel free to ask questions, or if you just want to share your thoughts, you know, if you think that this ordinance goes in the right direction or it doesn't, we will definitely share all of that information. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Tony. And thank you for all of the community members that have joined us. Really appreciate the questions and the dialogue. It's a technical but important ordinance, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.